roses were living the dream.
To you, my darling.
No, to you.
Until it all came crashing down.
You got fired.
Fired?
On August 29th, stop.
You stop!
And see The Roses. Rated R. In theaters everywhere, August 29th.
The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
I just kind of get this sense that oil traders seem to think Trump hasn't really been that tough on Putin. Like, he's saying all these things, and even for secondary tariffs, if you remember back a few weeks or a month ago, he was threatening 100%. Now he's doing 25%, and there are other things he could have done, right? He could sanction the tankers, he could sanction the state-owned refiners in India, or do much more targeted effort that will hurt Russia a lot more, but he hasn't.
US President Donald Trump is going to Alaska this week to size up Russian President Vladimir Putin. If it goes well, it could sow the seeds of the end of the war in Ukraine. But if it doesn't go well, not only will the war drag on, but the spats like the one with India and the US over New Delhi's continued purchases of Russian oil will continue.
Right. This is a proof point of a sort of thesis that the Trump administration has, right? He's always put himself forward as this idea of a peacemaker, despite strikes on Iran and various other interventions across the world. There was this idea that, if Trump was in the White House, the Ukrainian war would never have even happened, which I suppose you can't prove a negative. But as you say, there is an industry question that's underlying all of this, right? It's an industry that's very close to Trump's heart, and that's the oil industry. How this unpredictable situation could unfold and what it means for black gold is the focus of this week's Viewsroom. It's Jonathan.
And it's Amy. And this is the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that delves into the knottiest issues in business, finance, and economics with breaking views columnists. So this week, we're delving back into oil. So this is the market that we've looked at, many times, Jonathan. I think we've kind of gone through it. Yawen has certainly been a guest who we'll introduce in a few minutes. But we should also let our listeners know, Jonathan, that this is the last episode before our kind of summer hiatus. So we're going to be off for 2 weeks. I'm going to be off on a nice sun holiday. Jonathan, what are you going to be doing?
I'm going to be right here in New York City, glued to the workstation, of course.
Holding down the fort.
That's right. It's funny because August, typically, one thinks of it as a quiet month. This month has been anything but quiet, and we're probably going to see more developments across basically every key area of geopolitical rivalry and negotiation and so on. And Ukraine is taking center stage in that. And of course, this has been a humanitarian disaster that has been dragging on for years now. Everybody wants to see an end to this. How we actually get there is the question. Fortunately, we have a crack team to discuss it with us here. George Hay, European editor of Breaking Views, and, as you said, Yawen Chen, our oil expert, who is also a columnist in London. George, Yawen, you are both very welcome.
Hey, Matt.
Hi.
Yawen, as Amy mentioned, we've talked a lot about the oil market in episodes past, but there's just so much going on, so much price movement right now, a lot of volatility, as you would expect. I would think that traders don't exactly know which way to jump right now. Can you just tell us where the oil market stands today? How are investors reacting to this? Are you seeing a reaction to what's going on in a potential Ukraine ceasefire, negotiated end to the war, or is it just too early and kind of tremulous for anybody to be able to move on that?
Thanks, Jonathan. I think if I were to give you like a really high level view right now, traders are really bearish because for a number of reasons. One, you've got OPEC, the oil cartel that's been reversing their output cuts for the past few months, and starting September, they will unwind the last few barrels that they had cut in the last few years. There was, I think, that amounts to 2.2 million barrels. So you've got a market that's relatively well supplied, and on the other hand, you've got global demand concerns, obviously because of tariffs. I think what I heard was, other than the kind of tightness you see a little bit in the diesel market, all the other fuels, and in terms of supply demand, there's a lot of softness that's coming. And then geopolitical factors, like you said, people were worried about Iran and all these other things, and then it turns out that it seems that this kind of assumption that Trump only wants oil prices to be low seems to be proving itself right.
And can we maybe
I
just
still,
to make clear, because obviously, everybody is very concerned about what happened with energy prices coming out of the onset of the Ukrainian crisis. Can you maybe just walk through, like, for people who aren't entirely clear, like, what is the status right now? Obviously, you have major oil producers in the US, in Russia, in the Middle East. How has the market shifted as a result of the war in Ukraine?
yeah, so obviously oil is a very global market, right? So you've got the tankers carrying the oil, and they can literally be sold and resold in different markets. So ever since Ukraine, you've got a spike in prices that lasted for some time. But then I think what made an impact later was the sanctions that was done by Europe done by under the Biden administration as well. So you've got measures like the price cap, right? For example, Europe had $60 price cap. Now they're lowering down further, which means a lot of the cheaper Russian crude really found their markets shifted from, say, Europe to India and China, where they don't have the same kind of standard. They don't have the price cap or whatever, so they're taking the cheap crude. So you can see the data really shifting in terms of who is buying the Russian oil. I think that's why Trump has singled out India as one of the big buyers. But interestingly, at the same time, he didn't say much about China, who is the other big buyer that bought everything, including Russian gas and all these other fields as well.
I think that's a really interesting element of all this, right? So I think time to bring in George here. So George, as Jiawen mentioned, Donald Trump has introduced, we'll call them extra measures for India, right? In terms of because they are buying this oil cheaply from Russia, they're trying to deter that kind of behavior. So they've sort of added on additional tariffs onto that oil. Is that likely to work, do you think, in terms of that outcome, as in that you think that it just puts so much economic pressure on Russia that they have to capitulate, or they at least have to come to the negotiating table in a much more kind of engaged way?
Yeah, I mean, but it's worth kind of Yarwin kind of referred to it there, but it's worth kind of looking at that a couple of years ago, when the normal kind of backdrop to this is that under the Biden administration was that rather than kind of just completely stopping the flow of Russian oil around the world, which they could have done if they really wanted to hurt the Russian economy. The whole idea was that if you did that, then that might hurt the global oil price, and then that would hurt everybody else as well. So the plan under the Biden era was just to, as Yarwen said, kind of cap the amount of put a price cap on the oil that Russia could sell. But the whole point was that the likes of India and China were still going to buy it, and that's very much what they've done in the last 3-4 years. They've just been really, really hoovering it up. So from that point of view, kind of India was almost like helping out, in a sense. So they will have kind of looked at what Trump is now doing, and you can understand why they feel a bit peeved about it all.
Wait, sorry. So to be clear, what you're saying is like India was actually kind of playing into this unspoken thing where the Biden administration wanted to crack down, but it is a Democratic government. They have to worry about elections. They do not want the oil price to spike and thus, bring down the global economy and their political legitimacy with it. And so India was kind of like a pressure release valve, you're saying, effectively?
A little bit, yeah. And if Trump wants to look at it the way that he's now looking at it, which is, hang on, you're buying Russian crude and therefore financing the Russian war machine, then that is also a legitimate way to look at it as well. But it's a bit of a gear change to where we were. As to whether it works, I mean, what they've actually done is kind of the point is he's threatening, or he has threatened, higher tariffs on Indian imports into the US in general, rather than kind of making it specifically about oil. Now that's sufficiently annoying or problematic for India to probably make it worth its while to reduce its oil purchases, and there's an assumption that that is kind of what will happen. But as to whether that materially offsets the money that's ultimately going to Russia, that's just a kind of function of whether China steps in to buy a bit more. I mean, basically, India's buying around between 1.5 and 2 million barrels a day of Russian oil, which is a lot.
And so how much those Indian purchases, how much of Russian exports do those represent? Is that like a huge chunk?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, but they export around 5 million barrels a day. It's basically, it's a big chunk of that. And so, but the point is, like, how the extent to which that goes elsewhere. Now, there's a limit to the amount that non-Chinese buyers would go for it. I mean, they're still not going to go for it. But China is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, buyer of oil in the world. So they might just buy a bit more.
Yes, and I suppose as well, George, and maybe just to bring in Yao in here as well, the whole idea though would be as well is that the Indian buyers wouldn't have a way of getting around this, right? As in, do they have a way of getting around these sort of extra charges? Is there because that's the whole thing with oil, isn't it? It's like that there's always a funny workaround that you can try and buy the oil through smaller buyers, or maybe not the like state-funded companies, so that you can, you don't get punished as much. I'm just sort of curious, is that possible?
That tends to happen in China, but I'm not so sure that's a thing in India, though.
I think it has happened when there were a lot of like sanction concerns, because you use third-party intermediaries to kind of change the entities buying it, or especially if you're like a big state-owned company, you're worried about your dollar access. But I think what we're talking here is secondary tariffs, right? Which is slightly different. It's more of a blunt tool. But to your question, I think if they really need it, I can imagine the oil can find a way through China, for example, maybe, because you just kind of needs the destination to be different. And to George's point, when you got India and China as two big buyers of Russian oil and you're only cracking down one, you can imagine the other buyers taking it probably at a much cheaper price, and which makes re-exporting potentially profitable.
Right. And I kind of wonder, because like you say, the Indian purchases of oil were effectively this stabilizing element on the global market potentially. You would expect that the Trump administration would finally try to turn the screws on that if we're in like the final turn of the game here, right? If you're just trying to put maximal pressure on the Russian economy, you're trying to crash the price of Russian exports, you're trying to prevent purchases of Russian exports, you want to bring everybody to the table, like it makes a certain sense. I guess the worry is, right, that all of this falls apart and now we just have a new normal, nobody can back down, the war continues, and I presume we just like spiral from there, right? Is that kind of part of, because Jan, I know you mentioned that traders seem like somewhat bearish right now. Is that kind of a realistic thing to say?
I was quite surprised. Sorry. Yeah, I just kind of get this sense that oil traders seem to think Trump hasn't really been that tough on Putin. Like, he's saying all these things, and even for secondary tariffs, if you remember back a few weeks or a month ago, he was threatening 100%. Now he's doing 25%. And there are other things he could have done, right? He could sanction the tankers, he could sanction the state-owned refiners in India, or do much more targeted effort that will hurt Russia a lot more, but he hasn't. So I think because of all these behaviors that traders seem to think as theatrics, he wants to put some pressure out there, so it's not really working. And I feel like we're in this awkward cycle of, then if things are not working and Russia doesn't come to the table, then he has to do something even more aggressive. And then the question always is, would he follow through?
And George, I suppose maybe just to wrap this, I'm sort of wondering, are we still in the same place as we started, which is that ultimately, as Yawen said, that there are things that would really put pressure on Russia, but that the end result of that is so damaging for everybody else, for the economy, for the world economy, that's just not likely to happen.
Yeah, well, I think Yawen mentioned it earlier. This a key factor here, which is important, is the spare capacity that Saudi and UAE have. Theoretically, we're talking in terms of all the Russian oil that goes to India at the moment. If that all theoretically, if that all just kind of left the market, it wasn't in the market because Trump or another of the allies had done something that made it impossible to come out. There would still be a kind of plan B, which is Saudi and UAE have, depending on which number you look at, but between 3 and 5 million barrels a day that they could just deploy. And sometimes it's easy to kind of think, oh, that's just a cushion that Trump just needs to, press a button and then that suddenly splurges all that. It's a little bit more complicated than that, because Saudi and UAE have to want to do that. I think the point is there is a buffer there if Trump wants to be a bit tougher, but up to this point he hasn't been.
So we're still waiting all these years later for the definitive moment. I guess that's as good a place as any to wrap it. George, Johan, thank you so much for joining us on The Viewsroom.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Cheryl Pena in New York and Gregory Garner in Toronto. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune into our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.